Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Claire. I'm a contract librarian on assignment here with NOAA Central Library, and I'll be your host this afternoon. This seminar series is offered through the NOAA Central Library Seminar Program, which provides an educational forum for the presentation of ideas, research updates, and news in support of NOAA's mission. Today's webinar is brought to you by the NOAA Pride Employee Resource Group. Before we start, I have a few technical tips for attendees. Just so you are aware, you are muted and you are not able to unmute. However, if you have a question, you can type it into the question or chat panel, and we will get to those during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If you're having any audio or visual issues, if you can't hear the speaker or see the slides, please try logging off and logging back on, and that will solve most issues in GoToWebinar. As a reminder, this is being recorded. If you would like to revisit the seminar or view previous seminars, you can find them on our YouTube channel. Now I'm going to turn it over to Kenneth, who's going to introduce our speaker today.
So thank you, Claire, and happy Pride to everyone as we wrap up what's been a very busy June. I'm Kenneth Walker. I'm with the NOS Office for Coastal Management in Silver Spring, and my pronouns are he and him. And I'd like to thank the NOAA Central Library, Claire Myers and Katie Rowley for support of this webinar, as well as the NOAA Pride Professional Development quarterly webinars. And at this point, I'm very pleased to introduce Meghan Maury, who's Senior Advisor at the US Census Bureau. Meghan joined the Biden administration in January of this year, serving as a Senior Advisor in the US Census Bureau. Prior to this role, Meghan served as the Policy Director at the National LGBTQ Task Force, a position they were promoted into after leading the organization's criminal and economic justice project for several years. Meghan holds a law degree from Georgetown, a master's in business, and a bachelor's degree in accounting from UMass, and an associate's degree in accounting from Holyoke College. Meghan will touch on the current LGBTQ data landscape and how data on our community has impacted the LGBTQ advocacy movement, and how the movement is organizing to improve data collection for our community, and what lies ahead in the world of LGBTQ plus data. So, Meghan, welcome.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. I am so glad to be here. As Kenneth mentioned, I'm Meghan Maury. I'm a senior advisor over at the US Census Bureau, but I'm really a relative newbie at the Census Bureau. I just joined the Bureau in January, and before that was doing a lot of advocacy on LGBTQ data collection at the National LGBTQ Task Force. So I'm so excited to be here with you today to really share a lot of information from my old job, more so than from my new job, giving you a little bit of a landscape of sort of what LGBT data is out there that we used in advocacy, what sort of value we found in having data on the LGBTQ community, and a little bit of what's to come. So let me just share my slides here. All right. Hopefully you all can see this beautiful sunburst slide before you now. And I'm going to just jump in with talking a little bit about what data actually exists on the LGBTQ community. The sort of like TLDR is there's not a whole heck of a lot of it, but what there is that's out there is really valuable and helpful for our community. And so I want to talk through a little bit about what exists, and then what external sources outside of government sources that we always use to kind of supplement the data that we have on LGBTQ folks, and then hopefully talk about some pathways forward for LGBTQ data going forward. So the Census Bureau, where I work, we don't actually collect much data on sexual orientation or gender identity yet. Right now, what we collect primarily is same-sex couple data, and we do that through our biggest surveys, like the Decennial Census and the American Community Survey. For both of those surveys, we collect that data through what we refer to as the relationship question, where people identify their relationship to the household, or whoever the person one is that fills out the survey. And new for 2020, on the decennial census, you can actually indicate whether you're in a same-sex or different sex married couple, or same-sex or different sex unmarried couple. And that'll mean it's a little bit easier for data users, people who are kind of downloading the data and trying to find out information about same-sex couples, to see that data represented a little bit more simply for them. American Community Survey asks a lot more questions than the decennial census, so we are able to pull some pretty nuanced data about same-sex couples from that survey as well. That is all fantastic, but it is not the whole community. As you know, if we're collecting data on same-sex couples, that doesn't tell us really anything about same-sex or LGBTQ folks that don't live with their partner, even if they're in a same-sex couple, single LGBTQ people, transgender people, non-binary people, or anyone else that doesn't self-identify as part of a same-sex couple that's living together in one house. So it's also important to know where else we can go to get data on our community. And there are a bunch of sources, of federal sources for that information. There are quite a few surveys across the federal government that ask questions about sexual orientation. They exist in more surveys than I've even listed out here, but just to give you a sense, there's a bunch of health surveys that have asked questions about sexual orientation for some time. Those include surveys like the ones I have listed here, the National Health Interview Survey, the NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, and the National Survey of Family Growth. All of those are sort of health-related surveys that ask questions about sexual orientation, so we get good data on LGBT folks and health through those. There are also surveys that ask questions to a particular audience, so that we can get information sort of on a subset of audience through those surveys. Those surveys are surveys like the Youth Risk Behavior Survey that asks just young people about their behaviors that may put them at higher risk for various health disparities or mental health disparities, etc. Similarly, there's a national survey of older American ACT participants that asks older adults questions about their lives, and it asks a question on sexual orientation, so we can get good data on LGBT older adults through that survey. There's a national inmate survey that's asked to currently incarcerated folks that gets us pretty good data on LGBT folks who are currently incarcerated, and a national survey of children's health. So again, that's sort of like that intersection of young folks and specifically questions on health. So those kinds of population-based surveys can tell us about a particular subset of the LGBTQ community. And then there are other surveys that are sort of, again, focused in on a particular issue area that ask questions on sexual orientation and can give us helpful information about community. Those are surveys like the ones listed here: National Survey on Drug Use and Health, the Behavior Risk Factor Surveillance System, and the National Crime Victimization Survey. These tell us a little bit more information about our community with respect to LGBT folks in particular. There's also, I just wanted to make sure that people knew, there are questions that ask, surveys that ask these questions on sexual orientation, how you self-identify. But there's some surveys that also ask questions about sexual attraction or sexual behavior, because we know that especially when it comes to health disparities, but also some other factors about our community, we know that it's not so much how you self-identify that drives the sort of risk of a health disparity or mental health disparity, et cetera, but more who you're attracted to or who you're actually having sexual intercourse with that drives your risk. So for example, if you're looking at risk rates for HIV or another STI, you might care a little bit more about sexual behavior than you do about how a person identifies their sexual orientation. So just wanted to point out that there are some surveys that are asking those questions as well. And finally, there's a much smaller set of surveys that ask questions about gender identity. And when I say smaller set, I don't mean the surveys themselves are small. I just mean that the gender identity questions are not on as many surveys. But the surveys that those questions are on, like the National Crime Victimization Survey, tell us a really kind of nuanced story about how trans and non-binary people are experiencing disparities themselves. So those have been a really helpful source of data on our community over the last few years since we've started asking those questions. If you want a really complete list of the federal surveys that ask questions on sexual orientation or gender identity, there's a federal committee on statistical methodology that has put out a big old report that goes through every single survey, what kinds of questions they ask, how long they've asked those questions, how often they field the survey. And you can get to that by clicking the link that's in this presentation, which I'm sure we can send around, or just Googling FCSM, Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology, and looking for their sexual and gender minority research reports. Those reports are fascinating if you're a nerd like me, but they will tell you a lot more details about this kind of availability of data. But there's not just federal sources of data. So when I was doing my advocacy work, I really looked to these surveys a lot to learn more about the data points that I needed to know. But I also looked to a bunch of external sources. There are a ton of non-federal sources for data that, at least on the advocacy side, we often use to kind of bolster what we know about the LGBTQ community. First, there are a bunch of sort of public-private partnerships. So organizations like NORC, which is at the University of Chicago, I believe, often does surveys for the CDC or for NIH or something, or in partnership with NIH, that give us a lot of really robust data for a very small group of people. Those are really nuanced research projects, and they're really great for getting detailed information about community, but they're not usually data that you can extrapolate about for the whole country. So it's kind of, gives you detailed info, but not necessarily broad info. There's also a ton of other academic research that kind of fits into that same category, where a researcher at a university will study, for example, the experiences of men who are having sex with men who also identify as people of color in a particular geographic area, and they'll put out really detailed research about that. But again, it's a little bit hard to extrapolate out from that research to what we can know about the whole country. There's also a bunch of what I think of as policy and advocacy research. And I've just put a couple visuals up here of places to look and really cool data that's out there from policy or advocacy organizations. So those organizations are like the ones that I have listed here. Center for American Progress has an LGBTQ team that does both their own research on the LGBTQ community, which you can look at in the top right-hand corner. You see a little bit of a drop down where you can search in their data for information about experiences of discrimination, physical, mental well-being, access to medical care, that sort of information. They also will sometimes look at data that has been collected by a federal agency and do sort of research or reports using that data set too. So all of that is available on the Center for American website, Progress's website, great stuff on there. They focus a lot on poverty and immigration in the LGBTQ community. So you'll see a particularly large amount of information about those two topics on their website, but they've got information about a bunch of other stuff as well. I also look a lot to the Williams Institute, which is out at UCLA. They similarly look at research that's been collected by the federal government or other researchers, and look at their own and do their own research to sort of create new data for the LGBTQ community. And if you look in the middle top circle here, you'll see one of their most recent reports on LGBTQ people in the US. And they really try to churn out research so that we have data points on a lot of things that we don't get data on from the federal government. There's other groups doing this work too, like the Movement for Advancement Project. In the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a little map. The Movement Advancement Project, which their acronym is MAP, are super into maps, so they do a lot of geography-based research on the LGBTQ community and help us know sort of what disparities look like state to state. Right here in the center of your screen, you'll see a report that's part of the Black Census, which was done by Black Futures Lab. And they did a report on respondents to the Black Census that identified as trans or non-binary, and pulled out all the data from that into a report called Beyond Kings and Queens. It's a great research report, really tells a lot about how Black, trans, and non-binary people are experiencing systems of democracy. It's a really, really cool report. And then, of course, in our bottom left-hand corner here, you see the US Trans Survey. The US Trans Survey, which is fielded in 2015, is really the biggest data source for advocates on the experiences of trans and non-binary people in the US. The US Trans Survey had a huge response rate. They surveyed, I think, I'll get back to you on it, but something like 20,000 respondents, a huge number of people, about a third of whom were identified as non-binary and about 2/3 of whom identified as trans. The data in there is really rich, covers a really broad range of topics. So a lot of us in the advocacy community would use these kinds of sources to supplement the data that we were able to get from the federal government. So you may be asking yourself, why? Why do you use all this data? What's the point? Why do we care? Data's boring. But no, data matters for a lot of reasons. And I just wanted to tell a couple stories about why data was so important to me as an advocate. First, data on the LGBTQ community is important to LGBTQ folks for the same reason it's important to everyone. Data helps you understand your community. It helps you see trends and experiences. It helps you understand, for example, what proportion of the LGBTQ community is experiencing discrimination in housing and healthcare access, in employment and education, et cetera. But number two, it also helps us reveal unexpected needs about our community. And I think one of the most striking examples of this for me when I was an advocate was I worked a lot on an issue that we refer to as the criminalization of HIV. So for many, many years in this country, the status of having HIV was criminalized in a bunch of different ways across the country. And it was criminalized in ways that you might expect. So for many years, relationships between LGBTQ folks were criminalized themselves, and having a relationship with someone when you were living with HIV was actually criminalized. And for many, many years, we fought for this issue on the basis on the expectation that was the primary driver of arrests for HIV criminalization cases. But when we finally were able to do research on how LGBTQ people were being arrested or incarcerated for HIV-related crimes, we actually found that the primary driver wasn't these consensual relationships between people who were living with HIV, but instead it was actually that HIV was a status that drove people to have longer sentences or harsher charges for other crimes like drug use or sex work. And that was absolutely news to our community. We had been doing advocacy in a particular way for decades. And when we got this research, we thought, we're really maybe not focusing in the right place in this particular advocacy effort. And we completely turned within a matter of months to a whole new strategy for advocacy. So sometimes data really helps us reveal things about our community that we are not aware of, and that really can change the direction, the course of how a movement works for change and make sure that its community's needs are met. The third reason that data was so important to me as an advocate has to do with empowerment. So when I first started doing work on LGBTQ rights, I did a lot of work around homelessness and housing instability. And the reason I was drawn to that was that I experienced homelessness and housing instability myself as a young person. There were several years, a few years when I was living in a car or living on the street, and then several years when I was sort of bouncing around house to house, really never having a solid place to call home. And when I first started doing the advocacy around meeting the needs of LGBTQ folks who were experiencing homelessness, I thought my story was what mattered. I thought if I just could get into the office of this member of Congress or that local official and tell them about what my experience had been like, that their eyes would open and they would immediately support meeting the needs of LGBTQ young folks experiencing homelessness. I was incorrect. Time and again, I would walk into that office, I would talk about my experience, and they would say, you know, that's an amazing story. I'm so glad that you shared that with me, but, you know, legislation or programs to serve communities can't be based on the needs of one person. And I just don't think your story is that common. So I don't think it's something that I'm able to support at this moment. And I realized that if I didn't have data, if I couldn't show that my story was not unique, but in fact pretty common, we now know that 40% of young people experiencing homelessness identify as LGBTQ. We know that for subsets of the community, like trans folks, for example, up to 50% of trans folks experience homelessness in their lifetime. So there's really having that data that showed that my experience was not unique, but instead a part of a pattern that our community was experiencing, really did make the difference in those meetings with decision makers. When I could say, you know, it's not just me, here's data that shows that this is actually a really common experience, and we really need to make a change to the law or to the programs that are available to folks. It really made a change and helped me make the change I wanted to see in the world. So for me, data really had that personal impact of helping me to make a bunch of changes I wanted to see. And fourth, and I put this fourth, but it could just as well be first. I think, you know, the presence of questions about sexual orientation and gender identity in a lot of ways help people know that they're not alone. I think before we started asking questions about sexual orientation and gender identity, it was easier to for people to feel like they were the only one living the experience that they were living. But now that young folks, for example, can see that 7 to even 11% of young people identify as LGBTQ in some areas of the country, it helps them see that they are not alone. It helps us as adults know that our experiences are not unique. And that is such an important component of affirmation for our community that I wanted to include it here, even though it's not quite as in the same sort of vein as the other pieces I have on this slide. So just one more thing I wanted to share with you all, and then I would love to take any questions that anyone has, is I wanted to give you a little bit of sort of like the history of the advocacy around adding sexual orientation and gender identity questions to surveys, and then tell you sort of what I see going forward. So historically, our community has worked really hard on improving data collection on LGBTQ folks in a concerted way, probably since the movement started. But in 1990 was sort of the first moment when we saw the community come together to work with the federal government to improve data collection on LGBTQ folks. And that was in the 1990 census, the Census Bureau added an unmarried partner option to the relationship question on the decennial census. And LGBTQ advocates knew immediately that provided an opportunity for us to have data for the first time on same-sex couple households from a federal government survey. People were super excited about it. So they worked with the Census Bureau starting in 1990 and said, just give us the data. You're already asking this question. You're asking in a way that allows same-sex couples to kind of self-identify on their form. Let us have the data that comes out of it. it didn't work. We did not get good data in 1990, but starting in 2000, we actually started to get really good data on same-sex couples by kind of wrestling it out of the questions that existed on the decennial census form. So in 2000, we were able to take that relationship question, take the sex question on the census, mash them together, and start to tell things about same-sex couples in the US. Again, now it's much, much easier. The relationship question on the 2020 census makes it that we don't have to wrestle the data out of what the Census Bureau releases. We can just click on the button that says same-sex couples, and that data pops right up for us. But in 1990, we were really pushing to start making that happen, and we made a lot of progress since then. In the year 2000, the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, then at the time, ran a giant campaign called Queer the Census that actually activated tens of thousands of folks around the country to understand that data was important and to take an action in response. So in 2010, we sent these stickers out to everyone in the country that we could find and said, stick these to the outside of your census form when you send it back, and tell the Census Bureau you want to see an LGBTQ data question on the census. It was a great campaign, really raised awareness. It was very, very exciting. And in 2020, the task force again ran a really big campaign to get out the count. And our work from 2010 really paid off. In 2020, we had not just our organization, but hundreds of LGBTQ organizations across the country that understood the value of data, even if we were not represented the way that we hoped to be on the census in the future. They understood that being included on the form was still really important to us as a community. And hundreds of organizations joined together to help get out the census among the LGBTQ community, and it was really, really exciting. But there's still so much work to do. Right now, there is I can't believe I put a bullet on here with this many initials in a row, but that Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology has a sexual and gender minority working group that is working together to give recommendations to various federal agencies to add sexual orientation and gender identity questions to all sorts of surveys. There's people from across the government working on that working group, and they've made an enormous number of great proposals so far. Advocates on the outside of the government are also recommending to various federal agencies that they add questions to current surveys on sexual orientation, gender identity, or sexual attraction or sexual behavior, depending on the topic of the survey. There are still methodological challenges to work through. So for the nerds among you, I include myself in that group. Some of the methodological challenges we still need to work through include proxy reporting. So some surveys will ask, if they can't find a person who's, living in a household, they'll ask a neighbor to help give an answer for that house that's not responding. The decennial census does this as an example. And right now, we don't have evidence that shows that proxies do a particularly good job of identifying the sexual orientation or gender identity of their neighbors. That's a methodological challenge we need to work through for some of our survey collections. A second methodological component is translation. So many surveys are just fielded in English, and the English language versions of sexual orientation and gender identity questions have been very widely tested, and they work quite well. We also have seen Spanish language versions that work fairly well as well, but there are surveys that also are produced in other languages, and we don't necessarily have good testing on translation into those other languages. So that's another methodological challenge for us to overcome in the future. And then the last three here are a little bit connected. Question design, terminology use. So we know that both for sexual orientation and gender identity questions, language is changing quickly around how people self-identify their sexual orientation and gender identity. And when we're designing survey questions, we need to make sure that those survey questions resonate with the people that they're meant to get information from. So for example, young people are using, are more likely to use terms to self-identify like non-binary or queer, but we're still using questions that use lesbian, gay, and transgender, but not non-binary, for example, then it might be harder for young people to respond in a way that feels like it aligns with their identity. So those terminology questions, how young people experience survey questions, and overall question design challenges are all methodological components we need to keep in mind, although, you know, the same is true with the question design for other identity-related questions. So, for example, the questions that the census fields on race and ethnicity have shifted significantly over the decades for the same reason. There tends to be changes in how people self-identify their race and ethnicity, and we need to make sure that we're keeping up with the times. So that's all I have in my slides. I'd love to take any questions that folks have, if folks have any questions. Just gonna stop sharing my screen. I'm back.
Thanks, Megan. We don't have any questions yet, it looks like, but if any of the attendees have questions, you can type those in the panel on your screen and go to webinar.
And Megan, I'll jump in if there isn't another question. But I think your summary of the importance of data really resonates with me, and NOAA is a data-driven agency. But so from the perspective of our community at NOAA, we have anecdotes, but NOAA doesn't currently collect sexual orientation or gender identity data when employees are hired. There's not an opportunity to self-identify through My EPP. So, you know, NOAA has 11,000 employees. We have about 150 folks on our NOAA Pride mailing list, and many of those are allies. So it's a core issue that we don't have numbers to characterize our community at NOAA in what is a very data-driven agency. And I know that Pride in Federal Service is having a discussion at the federal level, but this is something that NOAA Pride is interested in pursuing. We have some feds data, but it's really more robust at the commerce level. And when you get it down to the bureau level or the NOAA level, sometimes that information is not as rich. So any thoughts about, from the federal perspective, about how to count our community within the federal workforce and agencies like NOAA?
I mean, you know the systems better than I do. I just started in the federal government, but I will say, you know, both from my experience on the outside and my new experience here, it's incredibly important to have that information about your business, about your agency, about your bureau, because it's impossible to know even if LGBTQ people are underrepresented in a bureau without having some sort of broad data on the community. Beyond that, it's difficult to know, for example, if LGBTQ people are able to find opportunities for advancement within an agency if you don't have that data, because you can't break down, you know, are most LGBTQ folks getting sort of plateaued at a GS-13, you know, or, you know, are there other trends we can see in advancement opportunities, access to trainings, access to all of the, you know, promotions or different kind of skills development opportunities across the bureau. So I will say it's really important. I'm not sure I know the best way to collect it, although I would say one thing I learned on the outside is there's one big struggle we had in our movement for a long time was that it was much easier to get questions on sexual orientation than gender identity added to surveys. So when you saw that list of federal surveys that include questions about LGBTQ folks, the sexual orientation list is pretty long and the gender identity list is pretty short. Some of that is for methodological reasons. the trans community is much smaller than the LGBT community, and so if it's got a survey with a small sample size, it can be difficult to collect good data on trans and non-binary folks. But for the most part, it's not a methodological question so much as it's a discomfort question. Often federal agencies had a much harder time understanding the need for data on trans and non-binary folks than on LGBT folks. But we know in community that trans people tend to have even more striking disparities when it comes to employment discrimination, access to healthcare issues, and on and on. So I would say, to the extent that you're looking to include information or data collection on the LGBTQ community, even if you don't yourself identify as trans or non-binary, that carrying that as part of the value, collecting data on both sexual orientation and gender identity is really critical.
And I would say the positive news there is we have some offices within NOAA that are leaning on NOAA Pride as they start to develop demographic questionnaires for their fellowship programs, for their staff. So we're really pleased to see folks in NOAA start to lean on NOAA Pride and asking us what is the best way to phrase these questions around sexual orientation and gender identity.
So we do have a question in the questions panel. Just a reminder to our attendees, you can type questions in there. So the question we have right now is, when questions shift, how do you deal with longitudinal data? For instance, if the way you ask a question changes, how do you compare over time?
Yeah, that's a super tricky question, and I think has been a barrier to adding SOGI questions to surveys for ages. So, for the Census Bureau, for example, there's a ton of longitudinal research, and often the people that we think of as like survey owners really are hesitant to add new questions or to change questions over time. But the trouble is when you're looking for new data on a community that hasn't been studied before, it can't just, you don't want to just start, you don't want to be limited to the surveys that are just starting now, right? So if we, the Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Statistics has been collecting data on incarcerated folks for decades, and didn't add a question on sexual orientation or gender identity until quite recently, in part because of legislation that was protective of LGBTQ folks within incarceration just a few years ago. And when they made that change, they were able to say, there's a break-in series in this study, and the break-in series allows us to look at new data on LGBTQ folks over time. And researchers know how to manage breaks-in series because they do it all the time for all the data that they work with. So I would say it can be a struggle to have a break-in series, but power through because we need the data. And beyond that, for sort of like the expert answer to your question on longitudinal data, I would refer you to some of the experts here at the Census Bureau who have been tackling these kinds of questions for a long time. I presented the other day with my colleague, Laquita Walker, who would be a great person to connect you with. So happy to follow up with you on that.
Great, and I can forward this question to you and you can follow up via email. Our next question, are you familiar with any current work happening, perhaps in response to the EOs that have been signed this year, and also the NIH NASEM panel study?
Yeah, so the panel study is a super cool thing that's looking at different aspects of asking questions on sexual orientation and gender identity. And when I talked a little bit about the methodological changes at the end of the presentation, those are the kinds of things that the NASEM panel study is meant to help us figure out. So like, for example, some of the researchers on that project are looking at what it would mean to have a screener question that works really well. If you're trying to screen to oversample LGBTQ people in your study, because you know that there's not going to be a high enough response rate if you just do random sampling of a community. You need a good screener question that helps you say, you know, this person self-identifies as LGBTQ, they're a person I can include in my oversample to really get good data on the LGBTQ community. So there's kind of like tricky, nuanced ways that you need to ask screener questions to get people in the door, to make sure that you've got enough respondents for the LGBTQ community to give good data out the back end. So there's a lot of really good research and testing work being done on those kinds of things. There's also research and testing being done on proxy response and on some of the other issues I named at the beginning. And that work will continue because we haven't been asking these questions for long enough to have really untangled all those questions. To the first part of your question about what work is being done across the federal government, I know there are researchers at every federal agency that are thinking about where it's most appropriate and most effective to ask questions about sexual orientation and gender identity. And a lot of it is housed in that Federal Committee on Statistical Methodologies, Sexual and Gender Minority Working Group. Oh my God, it needs a shorter name. But that working group has actually recently put out a number of reports and is about to put out a bunch more reports that talk about things like why we collect sexual orientation, gender identity data, how to tackle some of these complicated methodological issues, how to think about questions like what you do to deal with longitudinal data breaks in series. So I really encourage you to check out that working group's webpage. It's very, very cool. And I can link to it in the chat.
All right, we have another question here. It seems we're still at an early stage in our ability to assess survey data trends in the LGBTQ community relative to the general population. Do you think the data streams are stabilizing to the point that we are gaining the ability to look at more long-term trends, or should we continue to expect a lot more breaks in trends to get there?
I think there's some of both. So, you know, to give you an example, I mean, the sexual orientation, gender identity questions have not been asked for very long, right? Like, we just don't have good longitudinal data on the community. And in fact, even the community-based research projects that have been done, like the US Trans Survey, that's only been fielded twice. It was fielded once in partnership between the National LGBTQ Task Force and the National Center for Transgender Equality in 2008, I want to say, and then fielded again in 2015. They're gearing up to do that study again in the next year or so. So we'll see a report released in 2022 probably. But those are 3 data points. They're not it's not consistently researched. It's not long-term data. We just don't have good longitudinal data on the community, even in those sort of outside the government sources. But there are much smaller studies that are longitudinal that are starting to, that we can start looking at. But again, they tend to be on really tiny slivers of the community. So again, men who have sex with men who are living with HIV are a group that's been studied pretty deeply since the mid-'80s. There is some longitudinal data on that piece of the community, but again, it's not. It's a small slice of folks, and it's really kind of a group of people that we can't necessarily extrapolate from to the broader community. So for now, we're stuck a little bit with this more kind of snapshots in time of what our community looks like, but I hope that changes in the future.
Thanks, Megan. It doesn't look like we have any additional questions right now. I'll give everyone another few seconds here in case anyone's typing.
So I'll just jump in for a second. If there while any final questions may come in, but I will just put in a plug for NOAA Pride. NOAA Pride is an employee resource group focused on the needs of the LGBTQ plus community and its allies. Please visit the NOAA Pride website to check out our events and sign up for our monthly newsletter. And the NOAA's Office of Inclusion and Civil Rights website is the best place to find the links to all of NOAA's employee resource groups and affinity groups. So were there any final questions for Meghan?
I'm not seeing any additional questions here. So I just want to say thank you to Kenneth and our speaker, Meghan. Thank you all for joining us today. You'll be able to find this presentation on YouTube later this afternoon. When the presentation ends, you will see a survey. If you could take the time to fill this out. We do use these surveys to improve our library seminar service and to inform future seminar topics. So thank you all again for joining us today. Have a safe and enjoyable rest of your day.
Thank you very much, Meghan, and NOAA Pride may be following up with you on this data collection issue in the future. I think Meghan's providing her contact information in the chat. And NOAA Pride, our next event is a virtual happy hour, July 14th. All are welcome. And then September 14th, we have our professional development webinar, Career Paths with the NOAA Central Library. And then November 16th, Leadership Skills. And there are recorded webinars on the Central Library website on navigating USA jobs and resume writing, which were both full of useful tips. So thank you again, Meghan, for joining us, and happy Pride Month to everyone.
Thanks for having me.